what is significant about the women in Jesus' genealogy, according to Matthew. We're looking at these 5 women and the stories that they're tied to. And so we're going to spend some time in Genesis today looking at Tamar in particular and her story and what significance does she bring to the story that leads to Jesus. Genesis 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her. And she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went in to his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah my son grows up," for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" And he answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And he said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where's the cult prostitute who is at Enaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out, let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb, and when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out, and the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Okay, so we're trying to answer the question of Tamar. Why was Tamar in Jesus' line, in the opening genealogy of Matthew in particular? What's so important about Tamar to add her into that genealogy? And there's a lot of interesting oddities about this story here. One, that the identity of Tamar herself, she's pretty likely a Canaanite, a Gentile. It doesn't say that explicitly, but Judah is in Canaanite territory, found a wife for himself. He also found a wife for Er, his son. And so a lot of commentary scholars will link that and say that it seems fairly likely that she also was a foreigner to Israel. And that becomes significant later. And so here we have Tamar, likely a Canaanite, being given to Er as a son. And Er, we don't know why, but he acts wickedly before the Lord and gets put to death. So within the ancient world and within Israel, there was the cultural practice maybe makes us cringe a little bit, but it was for a really important reason. Like, one, for the woman herself, the standing of a woman was in the children that she bore. And so if she didn't continue on her family's name, then she was nothing. Same thing for men as well. But it was even more important in this more agricultural, land-based world to continue on your family name. And so there was a law in Israel where if the first son dies without producing an heir, the second son will marry the widow and produce an heir for the first son. So Onan says, well, the son that I bear, or any child really that I bear, will be heirs and not mine. And so I don't want to do that. Onan wants only a name for himself and doesn't want to help perpetuate the name of even his brother. And well, God didn't like that either. He also did what was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and so God puts him to death. Here we see, I think, some humor a little bit, but the other element of Tamar's identity is that she is very quickly put into this bad reputation. She has kind of a shady perspective, at least from the outside. And so the first one is that Judah misperceives the whole situation. Maybe he doesn't understand all the backstory here, but he just thinks, well, maybe it's her. Maybe Tamar, for some reason, maybe she has a curse on her or who knows what, but my sons keep dying when I give them to Tamar. And so maybe it's her. Maybe I want to save my third son, Shelah, and not have him go through that. And so she's kind of tainted as this cursed woman. And then later, because of her choices, but she actually is perceived, she's perceived as a prostitute. She's perceived as immoral. All right, later, the men say, well, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral and is being pregnant by immorality. And so there's this shady identity being given to her. And we could, especially as moderners, we can try to judge the morality behind all of this. Who was more moral, and was this a sin of what Tamar did? Was it a sin what Judah did? All of that is a really interesting conversation. Here's where the text goes with it, though. Finally, so he goes into her as if she was a cult prostitute, and she becomes pregnant. He thinks, well, the cult prostitute just disappeared. I don't know, but she has his signet ring, his staff, his cord. And so then when he says, well, bring her out here, she has to be burned because she was immoral. She identifies the man who impregnated her as the one who owned the signet ring, the cord, and the staff. And this is the fascinating statement from Judah right near the end, is she is more righteous than I, since I did not give my son Shelah. She is more righteous than I. There's a lot going on there. One, quickly, this word righteousness. In English, we usually think of it purely as this moral goodness, this moral declaration. And if you read it just like that, this whole passage becomes really confusing, because it's saying that she was moral in what she did and acting like a prostitute. And I don't think that's actually what it's saying. This word has a much broader meaning in both Greek and Hebrew. And the one that I want to latch onto, it has this status of covenant faithfulness. So to be an upstanding member of God's covenant, to be considered a full member of God's family, you would use the word righteous. To be righteous means you are a part of God's family. You are a full member of God's family. It's not less than moral goodness. Morality can be wrapped up in that word, but it means more than that as well. It also means this idea of being faithful to God's covenant. And if you read it like that, this whole passage opens up a lot more, and it gives us some really interesting insight into Tamar. So not only is she a Gentile, not only does she have these shady identities latched onto her, some of her own making and some not, she also portrays a woman who is adamant about remaining in God's covenant. Like, she is grabbing a hold of God's covenant and saying, I need to be a part of this story. My family line needs to continue because I want it to remain as a part of God's story. She doesn't want to just disappear into nothingness and be forgotten by time. And so the way that she goes through it, and again, we can give moral judgment here, but that's really not the point of the story. The story, I think the narrator and Judah himself gives this incredible declaration: she is more righteous than I am. What would that mean? Well, Tamar is showing this tenacity to grab on to God's covenant, to say, I deserve a place in God's covenant, and I want my line to continue. And the crazy thing is God seems to honor that. So her tenacity to the covenant, to remain faithful to God's covenant, to be righteous in that sense. She now has sons, and one of these sons becomes the father ultimately of David, and even more so of Jesus himself. And so it's that component of grabbing onto the covenant, of saying, I need to be a part of this story that God is unfolding through Israel. That I think that's a big reason why Matthew puts her in his genealogy, because she shows this incredible desire to be a part of God's covenant, even more than most of the men in her life, right? And so there's something really to emulate about that one aspect, not the moral judgment of what she does, but the covenant faithfulness that she portrays.